Hi, my name is Darren, and I love discussing African affairs on the African continent. Now, do you know what AGOA is called, or AGOA in full, or what AGOA is supposed to be doing? Now, AGOA is known as the African Growth Opportunity Act, which ideally was supposed to bring together African countries to have a trade agreement with USA, where they had a couple of things that were tax exempted. Okay, so it was basically a trade agreement between some African countries, I select of course not all of them, and America, to have a trade agreement whereby America would bring things to those African countries. Of course, they would import to those African countries, though that one is less talked about, okay? Because usually the biggest news here they usually talk about is, African countries have been exempted for some particular, by the way, not all goods, the particular goods to go to America. They never really talk about the other side. Mostly they talk about the benefits that are happening on the African side of it. But over the years, I should say they contributed to the growth of African businesses. The people who took advantage of it really benefited from it. I'll talk about countries like Mali, Chad, Burkina Faso, Kenya, Gabon, Uganda, and a couple of them. And indeed, it created jobs. However, some countries were scrapped off, of course, for different reasons. Number one, Uganda was put off. Central African Republic was put off. Countries like Gabon were also, I think Gabon was put off. Things like, there are countries that were put off ideally because of how the human rights situation in their country. And that didn't go so well because the latest that lost that status or agreement was Uganda. And I know that the government of Uganda is trying to have negotiations with America to reinstate that benefit for Ugandans. However, there's one guy who is in a queue. Likely, they may get the deal, they may renew the deal, or they may actually lose it. Because if it comes to September, and the agreement has not been renewed between this country that I'm going to talk about, things might be a little bit difficult for Kenyans. And I want you to think about this. Did I just mention the country? I didn't intend to mention them that way. But anyway, so Kenya is the latest country that is on the edge that if by September they have not agreed with the United States, they might lose that status as well. And the reasons for that, we can't know right now, but of course we can only speculate. Is it about the human rights, or is it about the democratic situation in the country, or will it just expire? However, Kenyans are responding a little bit fast because the government of Kenya, Ruto and his cabinet secretaries, are already in negotiations with America. In fact, the cabinet secretaries have already moved to USA ahead of a 3-day visit of Ruto. I don't know how many times he has to go to America, by the way, but I know he's going to move to go to America to strengthen those conversations there. But there are already talks with the U.S. Department for Trade and the Trade Cabinet Secretary in Kenya are already having those conversations, and Ruto will be in the United States probably to finalize the talks or to get the final verdict of what to happen. But most likely people would say, given the relationships of Kenya and USA in terms of they are the non-NATO alliance country, it hosts one of the biggest offices in Africa, the UN offices. In fact, some of them are already moving to Nairobi. All these big companies, tech companies, most of them are actually hosted in Kenya. So Kenya positions itself as that giant, giant in Africa. So without it, you might think that United States might be a little bit stuck when it comes to some operations, especially when it comes to defense. All the military actions that have been happening in Somalia, most of them have been happening off Kenya. That's why they've been basing to go and carry out missions in Somalia. So I think given that the history of relations and the activities that have been happening on the Kenyan soil by the Americans, one time we saw a warship actually come up to Mombasa, that level. So I think the relationship between the two countries will enable the quick signing or renewing of AGOA agreement with Kenya. and between Kenya and United States. However, you need to understand that this is not Donald Trump. He's Donald Trump. He can decide to kick off AGOA and retain the other trade relationships they have together, or other relationships they have together with the country. The two have traded about 1.5 billion between themselves. Annually, they do that annually, and that's a lot of money. And I will show you that Kenya managed to create 660,000 jobs from AGOA. Now, if you lose a deal like AGOA, then you're likely to see about 660,000 people on the streets. They will not have jobs. And that may become worse for Ruto. But on the positive side, like I said, given the relationships the two countries enjoy, there's a high likelihood that the agreement will be reached. Compared to Uganda, compared to Central African Republic, compared to Burkina Faso, Mali, Chad, and all this, those relationships are really terrible. So I don't see AGOA go back to those countries. But with Kenya, it may be quite a unique agreement or arrangement that Kenya will benefit from that. My name is Darren Bartlett. Subscribe and you will not miss out.